Welcome to the Adoption 101 webinar. I am Leanna Weimer, and thank you for spending the next hour with me. I am going to take you through a little bit of pre-adoptive information that you, if you're here, you've been wondering about, you are interested in learning a little bit more about adoption. So kind of through the course objectives of what we're going to talk about in this next hour is basic adoption process, what it looks like and what type of adoption, some adoption definitions and lingo that might be used or that you might hear going through your adoption process. And then overall, I just want you to feel a little more empowered and a little more educated on the adoption process and the adoption realm, basically, of all things adoption. So now, a little bit about me. You're kind of wondering, who is this person? My name's Leanna Weimer. I am a licensed social worker. My concentration is child welfare. I have been in the adoption field for going on 7 years. I have 6 years of attachment and trauma training, specializing in adoption. And then I have a year as an attachment therapist. I have an attachment specialty, as well as I am an adoption specialist currently. So I have a lot of different hats. I've worn a lot of different hats in the adoption world, and I just feel like I want to give some of my information to you guys. I see it as a necessity to be able to help you guys figure out what kind of adoption, being more prepared for the adoption, and what to expect when you're adopting. So, what is adoption? The Merriam-Webster's Dictionary of Adoption is the act or fact of legally taking another's child and bringing it up as one's own, or the fact of being adopted. So it's pretty basic, pretty simple. My definition, I would say, is the irrevocable, unconditional choice of bringing up a child into your home and showing them what it means to be unconditionally loved. So that's just something I want to kind of have you sink in and process a little bit. Not a lot of people really think about that when they are adopting. It's like, oh, this is a great idea. This is something we want to do, but we don't really know where to start. We don't know what that looks like. And I just want to challenge you on kind of your own definition of what you have in your head as adoption. So maybe take a minute and even write down what you think your definition of adoption is. Before we really kind of get started, I want you to write that down, and then at the end, we'll kind of revisit that. So there's not really much information about pre-adopt. There's not a lot of information about adoption in general. It is a very understudied and under-researched topic in the world of humanity and social work. Adoption kind of falls in the realm of attachment and trauma. So there's a lot more research in attachment and trauma than there is adoption. When you Google adoption or search adoption, the ASPCA comes up. And really just to give you a number of kind of the difference between animal adoption and adoption is there's 3.2 million shelter adoptions a year. So I kind of want you to remember that. As we get going here, I'll kind of bring that back up in another slide in the future. So now that we have our adoption definition written down, there's different types of adoption that you need to know and that you need to understand. So there's private adoption, which falls under, technically, a lot of adoption is going to be private adoptions. So there's birth parent, embryo, step parent, and grandparent are the different types of private adoption. So birth parent is just as it sounds. It's a birth parent placing their child up for adoption. And, we'll not get into circumstances or, morals, beliefs into that. But obviously, for whatever reason, they are choosing adoption. So embryo adoption is kind of the same, where a couple might have gone through IVF. They've frozen a lot of their eggs that are fertilized. Maybe they had one work out, thankfully, and they don't need any more of their frozen embryos that are fertilized. So that couple can choose to place their embryos up for adoption. So that adoption still goes through the adoption process. You still have to go through the home study. You still have to go through all of that process of adoption. There's some different laws and different things that might change with that. Each state is a little bit different, and some states don't have any laws at all. So some of the laws haven't really caught up with science yet in the embryo adoption world. Some agencies won't do embryo adoptions, so it just depends on your agency as well. So there probably is an agency in your state that would be willing to do that. You just have to be able to find one. Their step-parent and grandparent are both just like it sounds, where a step-parent or a grandparent steps up and adopts the child. So step-parent is a little bit different just because step-parent is probably most likely living with a birth parent. So that birth parent can sign off and say, yes, I'm consenting to my spouse or partner being able to adopt my biological child with another person. Grandparent is through whatever circumstances, whatever happened, the grandparents are now stepping up and going to adopt their grandchildren. Some states do it a little bit differently. It's not all the same. Some judges order a home study to be done, since a lot of it is within the birth family, typically. They won't sometimes order it. They won't see a need to do it, and especially if the children are already placed in that home and have been living in that home and there's no other concerns. A lot of times they just process the adoption. Then there's foster. So a lot of times you can sign up to be a foster parent and you have a child, and then that child becomes eligible for adoption. So you are able to adopt that child and have that child be permanently yours, however long that may be. The adoption process can be lengthy, but also the foster process can be pretty lengthy. So it can be anywhere from maybe 6 months to a year to, I've heard, as long as 5 years. It just depends on the birth parent. It just depends on the case. It depends on the caseworker. It depends on the judge. It depends on a lot of different factors kind of going into that. And then there's foster to adopt. So really the difference between fostering and foster to adopt is you are fostering with the intent of adoption. Fostering, you don't go into fostering with the intent to adopt. So foster to adopt is you have a home study, you get licensed as foster parents, but you don't take a placement until that child is legally orphaned, is what we call it, where the termination of parental rights has happened. So that child is either going to be placed in a residential facility, is going to be placed in a foster home temporarily until they find a foster to adopt situation. So the foster to adopt situation is we are going to place this child in your home for you. The intent is for you to adopt them, but the adoption hasn't taken place, and obviously they want to make sure that it's a good match before the adoption happens. So they kind of do the fostering first, but it's still with the intent of foster to adopt. Then there's international, and I feel like a lot of people, when they think of adoption, they think of the international piece. So international is just as it sounds. You're adopting a child from a different country and bringing them back to the States, and you are adopting them. Then there's open or closed adoption. So you have to decide, do I want an open or closed adoption? Open means you have all the communication, everything's good, you're open to being willing to communicate with that birth family. Closed is we are not open, we are not going to write letters, we are not going to have any communication with this family. So it's kind of self-explanatory, but really think about it on a continuum. So it can be as open and as closed as you really want it to be. Is it something that you're willing to do just some letters every once in a while? Or is it something that you're willing to do presents and maybe Christmas, birthdays, special events? Is it something that you do a weekend once a year? Is it, what does that look like? What does that look like for you? And really you have to take into consideration, what are some of the safety concerns that I have bringing this child to their birth family, knowing full well there may be safety concerns, possibly, not all the time, but possibly. Is this really safe for my child? Is this safe for us? Is this going to be a good relationship that we can cultivate down the road? Or is this something that we're open to right now? Or is this something that maybe it's kind of a wait and see, and maybe we'll keep in contact just enough to kind of keep contact numbers, phone numbers, addresses, stuff like that, so that when the day comes, maybe we'll reevaluate. So really it's on a continuum, and the thing I tell people is you are the adoptive parents. You are going to be legally the parents of this child. Don't let the birth family bully you into anything you don't want to do. So if that means you're not comfortable, then you're not comfortable. Don't sign any adoption agreement that you are not 100% fully agreeable to. You can make a post-adopt agreement. You can talk to your lawyer about that. A lawyer usually can draft it up, or you can draft up at least the bullet points to give to your lawyer to have the birth family and you sign on the day of the adoption. If that's the the process you decide to go, if that's the process for private adoption. Typically with international, it's a little bit harder to have an open adoption. So that's even kind of something to consider too, is the different type of adoption. Is this going to be able to be an open adoption? Is this something that we're able to do down the road? Or maybe we've lost contact with them and we don't know their birth family, where it's just not really a possibility. That's also a scenario that can happen. Really, it's up to you and up to each family. Like I said, please don't let the agency or the birth family make you feel obligated to do anything you don't want to do. You are legally the parent. So also something to consider is we've noticed that in the day and age of 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and the power of social media, that really closed doesn't mean closed. And closed doesn't mean closed forever, usually. So with 23andMe and Ancestry.com, typically you are connected to your ancestors and people that are related to you if they've also done that test. So a lot of times adoptive families have told me too, we have kind of an unintended consequence where 23andMe is great for medical information if you don't know any medical history on your child. It's a great way to get some at least demographics and markers of kind of where your child is at medically. But it also can have some unintended consequences of being able to connect them to some family members. So that's something to think about. And even when your child gets social media, that's something to think about is, are they going to be contacted by aunt, uncle, cousin, grandma, whoever? Are they going to be contacted and sent a friend request? And how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to process this and answer our child and say, we're not really comfortable with you doing this right now, or maybe let's sit down and talk about it. Maybe I have your password and all of that stuff. Obviously, they're still a kid. You should have their password and stuff anyway, but that's something that, maybe we'll have a conversation when the time comes. It's also something to consider. Many states have adoption laws that have changed where the adoptee is able to access their birth records at some point. That could be 18, that could be 21. Different states have different things, so you can look up your own state, but a lot of times that adoptee can access their records as well too. So when they learn that and when you are able, I would recommend how you're going to handle that as well, to kind of consider with the open and closed and kind of all of that into consideration. What do we want them to know? What maybe is appropriate to wait and tell them a little bit later down the road? And how are we going to handle this? And what does this look like? What kind of conversations are we comfortable having? And is this something we're willing to have these conversations with our child about? Discussing open and closed and how you're going to handle that is very important to be on the same page. So in consideration as well, there's always going to be an opportunity for a transracial adoption. So transracial or transcultural adoption means placing a child who is of one race or ethnic group with adoptive parents of another race or ethnic group. In the U.S., these terms usually refer to the placement of children of color from another country with Caucasian adoptive parents. In the U.S., these terms typically refer to the placement of children of color or children of another country with Caucasian adoptive parents. So, is that something that you're willing to do? Is that something that you are wanting to do? Is that something that you specifically want to seek out? With consideration of transracial, 44% of U.S. adoptions are considered transcultural or transracial. So that's something to consider is that most likely that would be opportunity for you to possibly pursue. Educate yourself. Understand the cultural differences. If you are open to this and you are open to adopting a child of a different background than you, be open and educate yourself on the different cultures, the different ethnic groups that you may be able to adopt from, especially international and even the different cultures here in the U.S. Everybody's different. Every culture's different. Thinking about community and thinking about your community where you live. Do you live in a diverse neighborhood? Is your community accepting of diverse backgrounds and diverse people? Do you have people in your lives with the same culture or race that could help you or maybe answer questions or educate you? Consider in consideration of parenting, become intensely invested in parenting. Tolerate no racially or ethnically biased remarks. That's in the grocery store, that's in school, that's in church, that's anywhere. Your child is watching, your child is paying attention to how you respond to that. Surround yourself with supportive families and friends. Again, that is just like it sounds. Get supportive people around you. Celebrate all cultures and talk about race and culture. Don't make it a taboo thing. Don't make it something that you don't address or that you don't bring up and you don't talk about. There's a ton of resources, there's a ton of videos, there's a ton of educational history you can educate yourself on and you can be a part of. There's a lot of really cool festivals and fairs and different foods and churches, and different cultures have different things and you have to be creative in finding it. But really, the really cool thing about America is that we have a lot of those things here stateside. There may be different pockets where there's more of a dense population of a certain culture, but there's a lot of fairs, there's a lot of different restaurants and foods and celebrations that happen that are important to be a part of, especially if that's something that you are wanting to pursue and something important for your child to be a part of if they're a part of that culture. And again, exposing your child to those experiences that he or she develops physical and intellectual skills that build self-esteem. So again, taking them to a fair or a different restaurant that is of their food and their culture, and maybe even learning to cook some of their favorite foods at your house. Those things are really empowering to the child, and maybe even letting your child help teach you some of those things. If they are the appropriate age and old enough, that's an amazing bonding opportunity. And taking your child again to places that people present are from his or her race or culture. So that's always something that's important too. Does it look like we need to change them schools? Do we need to move? Do we need to change churches? Surrounding them and having different things, like maybe even looking at a different doctor. Is there a doctor in your community, or at least commutable, that you would be able to take your child to that's of the same culture? There's different ways of incorporating the culture. You have to be a little creative, but there may be opportunities right under your nose that you haven't even thought of. So that's just something to think about. And how are we going to incorporate this? If we do take on a child that is a transracial adoption, how are we going to successfully incorporate this, and how are we going to set ourselves up for success when bringing them home? Now we get into trauma. So most likely your child has experienced trauma, and ACEs means Adverse Childhood Experiences, was developed by Dr. Anda, and ACEs are very important to understand, and most people have experienced one ACE, at least in their life. So at least every person you know has experienced an adverse childhood experience. Most likely your adoptive child has experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. One of them just for the fact that they are adopted. So trauma can cause physical, social, emotional, and behavioral problems that can persist later in life if untreated. So we know that children that have 6 or more ACEs is a lot more likely to have early death, chronic illnesses, a lot of heart issues. It's pretty scary stuff. I don't need to go into all of the details, but there's a lot of concern there for them to have these ACEs and these adverse childhood experiences. You just have to understand, and what I want you to know is that there is a correlation between adverse childhood experiences and bad physical and mental health. So nearly half, 46% of adopted children have experienced 4 or more. So 46%. I know I mentioned the 4 or more. Acute, complex, and chronic trauma are the 3 different types of trauma that you can experience in your lifetime. Acute is a one-time event. It happened quickly, maybe a car wreck, something like that, and it didn't happen again. Complex is that you had maybe 1 or more events happen all together. So maybe it was a hurricane and you lost a family member during that hurricane. So maybe it was like a natural disaster, you had a death and you lost your home. So complex is that it affects more than one aspect of your life. And then chronic is it happens over and over and over and over and over. Most children have experienced chronic trauma that have been adopted. So that's something also that I want you to think about is that a lot of times it's not acute and it's not complex, it's chronic. It's happened over and over and over. Research reveals that foster and adopted children have especially high rates of internalizing disorders, such as anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Research also found high rates of externalizing disorders, such as ADHD, ODD, and conduct disorder. So, again, most likely your child has experienced a lot of these things that have caused PTSD, ADHD, ODD, some of these mental health diagnoses. So, are you prepared? Do you know what those things look like? Do you know those diagnoses? Are you comfortable with some of those diagnoses? Do you have insurance that covers therapy? Maybe that's some things to think about. Or, is there a specialist in your area? Do you have access to good therapy? Would you go to online therapy, or would you have a therapist in your town, or maybe come to your home? There's a lot of different avenues, but again, being able to be comfortable with some of those diagnoses and educating yourself on most likely some of these diagnoses that will be coming into your home and presenting themselves. It's good to have some education on it beforehand, before it really rears its head, basically, in your home, so that you're able to identify it and know quickly what it is, so that you can get your child help quicker. Research suggests that adoption, especially earlier in life, maximizes chances for a positive life course trajectory. So again, it shows right here how powerful adoption is. Adoption is such a life-changing event for everyone, but it really is life-changing and saving for that child. And so it's something I kind of wanted to leave on a positive note, that you are that change agent. You as adoptive parents can be so impactful and powerful to that child and change the trajectory of their life. It's a huge undertaking, but it's a huge privilege as well. So now we kind of get into attachment. So Harry Harlow in 1951 worked with monkeys and did an experiment where he had two wire monkeys, one that had a kind of terry cloth over it, and one that had a bottle. So one kind of representing comfort and nurture, and one kind of representing your hierarchy of needs and you being able to get your basic needs met. So they put a baby monkey in the cage, and they would watch and see where the baby monkey went. Monkey would go get the bottle or eat, and then go to the terry cloth. So the terry cloth monkey. So that monkey showed them that monkey needed their needs met and needed to get fed, but that monkey still went to the terry cloth and still went to that mom, the wire mom, for nurture. And then John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth kind of continued on that theme and kind of continued on that hypothesis, and really did a lot of research with World War II effects on children. And so they saw that there was a lot of orphaned children during World War II because of soldiers and moms and dads getting killed. And so they researched a lot of children in the hospital that were even separated from their families. And they saw the effects of that, and researched the effects of what these children were coming out of the hospital with, what kind of diagnoses, what behaviors they were representing, and different things that happened while they were in hospital and separated. The Strange Situation was developed by Mary Ainsworth. After she kind of was a protege under John Bowlby, she took it again another step further and developed the Strange Situation. This is something that you can look up on YouTube. It's actually really fascinating. She developed 4 different types of responses that babies will have when caregivers come into the room or leave the room. So that's why she calls it kind of the strange situation. She puts these babies into strange situations that they're not used to. And she kind of monitors them, watches them, and watches their reactions. Attachment can be used to describe an emotional bond to someone. And typically, kind of for the sake of today, we're talking about attachment as far as an attachment to a caregiver. Once attachment has happened, attachment can be transferred. We know that children typically develop their attachment style by the age of 5. So once it's developed and once they are 5, we know that it can be transferred. That doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be transferred until they're 5, but it just means that 5 years old, really, they're probably not going to change a whole lot in their attachment style. And that goes for up to adult. They will have that attachment style. With the child, it will follow the mother and then the mother's mother, like the mother's lineage of females and women in that family. So the 4 different attachment styles that Mary Ainsworth developed in this strange situation is disorganized, anxious ambivalent, anxious avoidant, and secure. So disorganized is when the baby sees the mom leaving, the baby doesn't know how to respond. It's like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with myself. I'm disorganized. I'm beside myself. I don't know how to handle this. Anxious ambivalent is no reaction. Flat, I don't know what's going on, but I don't really care. I'm going to be really calm, cool, collected, and I'm not going to show any emotion on my face. Anxious avoidant is I'm going to distract myself and pretend like I just didn't see my mom leave. Like, I'm just going to avoid the conversation. And I feel like you probably know some adults that do that. And then secure, of I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm going to look for maybe other things to comfort me during that time that mom's gone. But when mom comes back, I'm happy to be reunified. I am so ecstatic to see my mom again. So with adult attachment, you can take an adult attachment interview, and it's basically a self-assessment, and it's something that is pretty in-depth. It's sometimes brings up hard conversations and hard topics that maybe you're not prepared for. That doesn't mean that we can't change the trajectory today, and that doesn't mean that we can't know better and do better. And knowledge is power. You know, a lot of people, this is newer, relatively newer work and research. So this is something, again, that I would encourage you to take and encourage you to educate yourself on. So if you search it, you can find it. It's really easy. It takes a couple minutes, and you get the results right away. So it's good to know, even before you get a child in your home that may have a different attachment style. I would say typically adoption children kind of follow in the disorganized, where they just don't really know how to respond. They don't really know what to do. You know, they haven't had a lot of secure attachment. They haven't had a lot of security in their life. They've had a lot of change, and they don't trust adults very easily. So a lot of them are disorganized, of like, I kind of have to trust you because I have to get my needs met, but I'm not trusting. And I don't know that you're going to get all of my needs met. And especially, I know that you can maybe get my physical needs met. You know, I might have had a caregiver give me food, but I'm not going to have somebody meet my emotional needs. So, you know, again, it kind of comes down to their experience. But typically, I would say even, you know, some children have had a lot of foster care experience. So fostering is also a great way. And fostering, again, if you're a foster parent, you can change that attachment style. And, you know, obviously with them and with the experiences they've had, fostering is a better way to go than an institution or institutionalized living, where they're able to develop an attachment with a primary caregiver. That's optimally the best, but, you know, obviously sometimes internationally we know that kids don't come from foster care over there. So kind of the general overview of adoption. I know a lot of people say it takes forever, and it does. The adoption process takes a very long time. And a lot of people say it's a hurry up and wait type of situation, where you're hurrying up, you're getting things completed, and then you have to wait again. So a lot of times, like, there is a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of process. It's a lot of just tedious work to complete the adoption process. And so really you start with the application, filling out just a general inquiry. You know, you look for your agency, look for the agency that you feel like fits you best and fits your requirements of what you want. You've looked at kind of the different types of adoption, and then you decide, okay, I'm going to go with a private agency, or I'm going to go with an international agency. I want a Christian agency is important to me. You know, look at all of your requirements and what kind of, maybe even a different, if you're looking at international, making sure that that agency has that program. So if you're looking for a specific country, they call them programs. So each country has their program, and agencies call it that program. So looking for that, filling out that application, you decided on the agency, and the agency has accepted your application. They've contacted you back. Now it's time to do your home study. So the home study is where a social worker comes out and completes an interview with you, basically just to get to know your life and get to know you and your spouse or a partner, just about your life. about your jobs, your finances, families, extended family, where you live, maybe animals in the home. They kind of look at the complete picture of your life and your setup. It's a lot of people get nervous about it. Honestly, I do home studies, and it's really not nerve-wracking. I know it kind of feels like your life is under a microscope at that point, but really, I have not had to deny a lot of people. So home study involves a lot of paperwork, a lot of paperwork. So you are completing things like getting a doctor's note, a psychiatric appointment, and going for a psychiatric evaluation. Maybe it's getting, all your house information, mortgage, bank statements, job statements, insurance, looking at different background checks that you have to complete. And your agency will walk you through that. Your agency will tell you everything that you need and need to complete. So really it's just a lot of, also the social work is just verifying that information and just making sure that what they're putting in the home study is accurate. Typically then the social worker will give it to you to review and look over and make sure that everything is an accurate picture of your life. And then once you approve it, then it will be sent to the agency. The agency then will be able to send it on to the government. Now, then it's probably, if this is an international adoption, then you will complete a dossier. So the dossier is for international adoptions only, but it is also kind of a home study on steroids. So it's all of the paperwork that you just gave your social worker and the social worker's home study then. So basically it's everything all packed into a packet that you're then giving that international government for them to look at and them to review to make sure that you are an appropriate family or a couple to adopt. Typically then each adoption always, no matter what type of adoption, has court, and you will have court, and that looks different for every adoption, but you at least have some type of court proceeding. And internationally, there might be 2 different court dates you have to go through. Typically there is a process. Some countries make you actually do the adoption in country while you're there getting the child, and then you come back and actually finalize the adoption here in the States. And then you always, once the adoption finalizes in country or here in the States, and then you will have post-placement visits. So after the post-placement visits, then you are done. You are completely 100% done with the adoption process. So post-placement visits can range. I've heard of like 1 month, 3 months, 6 month, 1 year, 2 year. With the 3 to 5 years, you're just doing a self-report. So really you only need the social worker to do the 1, 3, 6 month and then 1 year and 2 year post-placement. So, and those post-placements cost money. It does cost the social worker to go out and do those. But typically, even for private agencies, you do have some type of post-placement follow-up. But then when you have a foster grandparent or step-parent situation, that can also look different. And again, that child might already be placed with you before the adoption happens or before court happens, obviously, but they may have been placed with you for years, obviously. And some situations of court do not require a home study, as previously mentioned. Sometimes, the judge will look at it and just be like, okay, they're fit, this is good, we don't need to do a home study, we're good to go with, to proceed forward with the adoption. So this is, again, kind of a general overview. This isn't a very exhaustive list or the exact process. I just want you to kind of understand and know some of this language and know some of the things that will happen when you get into the adoption process. You might be required to do a home study. You might be required to do the dossier. You will certainly go to court, and you will have post-placements. A lot of the post-placement visits are really fun, and it's really rewarding for me, even as somebody that does the home studies. And then the post-placement, I love being able to get to see the kids and be able to hang out with them and finally meet the kid, because it's been a couple of years, probably most likely, that I have met with the family and been working with the family to bring that child home. So it's really fun and really rewarding to see that kid home. One more thing before we move on, you might have to do an adoption update, so a home study update. Typically, a lot of international adoptions, you will have to do at least one update, probably. We've seen more and more delays of the adoption process happening, so that is something to consider and be aware of, that you might have to do an adoption update. And the update is pretty easy. It's not very extensive, but there is a process to it. A social worker has to come out, has to re-verify everything. It's not as expensive as doing the initial home study, and especially it'll go pretty quickly if nothing has changed. If you don't have a job change, we have to run background checks again, different things like that. But if you haven't moved, you haven't changed jobs, your finances haven't changed that much, or big drastic changes haven't happened, it's pretty easy, pretty painless. It's just another process and delay that you have to do. A majority of the reason why you have to do the update is background checks are only good for a year, and make sure that they're up to date and current within that year. So that's why an adoption agency may be reaching out to you and saying, hey, we need an update, if you've been waiting a year or longer. So some adoption statistics, I kind of just want to give you an overall picture of what some adoption statistics are here in the US specifically. There's 135,000 adoptions that happen each year in the US that are finalized, which is a really cool number, and something really cool to think about, that there's 135,000 children that get adopted in the US each year. 2% of Americans have adopted. So 2% of the whole population has adopted. A third of couples in the US have considered adoption. So that's actually a pretty large number as well. If you stop and think about it, that's a pretty staggering number. If a third of those people actually would consider adopting, the numbers of children eligible for adoption would go way down. There's 19,942 international adoptions that happen in the States. And also, I will say this is 2 years old, some of these statistics. So some of this may have changed a little bit, but probably not huge. So 19,942 international adoptions happen in the US. 60 to 70% of adoptions are considered open adoptions. So again, don't let that be a deciding factor, though, when you are looking at if I should do an open or closed adoption. Don't let that be something that intimidates you or something that you're concerned about. Do what's best for you and your family. 7 million of Americans are adopted. So that's a pretty big number as well. 59% are from child welfare. 26% are international adoptions. 15% are private. So private is actually the smallest number. Again, 59% are from child welfare, which is the largest number. There are estimated that 1 to 2 million couples are waiting to adopt in the U.S. 60% of kids spend 2 to 5 years in foster care on average before they're adopted. So again, with that foster and foster to adopt, that kind of changes some of those things and some of those wait times for the years at least. So that doesn't include the foster to adopt. That's just straight fostering, are the 60%. So a little bit of more statistics for you. Nearly 50 years ago, many Americans believed that natural or biological parents should be the one to raise their children. So that was something that really wasn't preferred, or something that isn't even as accepted today. With just the last 50 years, we've changed kind of the narrative of that in the last 50 years, which is amazing. In 2006, replication surveys from 1953, results found a persistent belief that adoption is second best to biological reproduction. So when asked about that, a lot of people still believed that having your own children was better than adopting. So there still is a little bit of an adoption stigma out there. Again, a lot of people kind of have their own beliefs or their own commentary in their head about adoption and what that looks like. You will experience this probably when you tell people that you are adopting. People are like, oh, you can't have your own children? Like, that's the first thing they say. That's the first thing that comes to mind. That's the first instinct. That's the first sentence that comes out of their mouth. Oh, you can't have your own children. And it's like, not necessarily, no. I've met a lot of couples that actually, they can have children. They can have children just fine. They know that they can. Everything looks great physically. And, they're healthy people. There's no reason why they couldn't have their own children. They just feel led to adopt. So that's kind of a stigma, I would say, definitely. Again, it's 2021, but still, it's not that long ago. 2006, again, researchers found that adoptive parents were portrayed more positively, whereas adoptees were depicted to have more behavioral and emotional problems. And if you think about that in the news, in movies, and TV shows, things like that in kind of the media realm or social media even, with news articles and stuff like that, you will see that a lot of times that parent is painted as kind of the heroic savior of the child, and the child is depicted as the problem, the behavioral issues, some of that. So, in consideration to adoption, textbooks or research says that psychological issues, the high cost of adoption, legal difficulty, long waits, unknown genetic problems, lack of health information, and privacy invasion are just some of the reasons why people don't adopt and some of the concerns that people have when adopting. So I will say that some of the legitimate concerns, those are definitely concerns for sure. But I would argue also some of those things you could write down for your own children, your own biological children. So it's always kind of a gamble, and even having your own biological children is a gamble. Again, like, you might know the genetic history of the child, obviously, if it's coming from you and your spouse, but maybe not always, and that's okay too. Again, those are just some of the reasons why, but I think a lot of people don't think about that could also happen in a biological family, not just an adoptive family. So, kind of the cost breakdown, I hear a lot of people talking about cost, and the reasons why not doing it is because of the cost. So, the average cost of an adoption is $15,000 to $43,000 US dollars. I did not look up any other country. That's just here, again, in the US for private adoption. So that's really probably paying the agency, that's probably paying the mom something or paying her hospital bills, and that's also, paying for the child. And the home study, some of the lawyer, legal fees, court, some of those things as well. And some of the paperwork, you're paying for the background checks, some of those things as well too, some of the paperwork. And then foster care could be anywhere from free to $2,500 with the incentives as well. So there's a lot of incentives when you do adopt from child welfare or your child welfare, the state of your child welfare, that you can have incentives depending on their age. You can carry Medicaid on them. You can get a stipend covered when you adopt them. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about what type of adoption, that is something you can have paid for. And a lot of times when you are adopting out of foster care, the lawyer and court fees will be covered by the state welfare system. And then international adoption, it varies. It can vary by country, but typically it's $35,000 to $48,000 range. The cost breakdown is between the agency, social worker, travel, documents, again, looking at those background checks and some of those things, lawyer, court fees, all the things that are needed for the child. And again, like, a lot of people kind of scoff at the price of some of those things, but really when you take into account, especially internationally, if you're taking into account the plane ride, you're taking into account the court fees overseas and here in the US, there's a lot of expense, and it's a lot of people that you have to pay to make all of this happen. Internationally, you also have to pay for medical clearance, so you have to pay for a doctor to see your child and clear them medically before they're able to fly to the US for you to bring them home. So, I mean, all of those things rack up, but it's not just one person benefiting off of this child. There is something called the Hague Convention, HAGUE, if you want to look into it and you're interested in the international adoption sector of things. And it was intentionally set up that way because we definitely don't want trafficking. We don't want that child to be trafficked, but we don't want that child to be placed without parent permission, obviously, either. So there's a lot of checks and balance that has to happen to make sure that it's legal and make sure that it's not under the table and there's no piece of it under the table. A lot of issues that can happen if there's not that checks and balance system. So we fall under the Hague Convention is all you need to know, and we have to have that checks and balance, but not one person is benefiting off the cost of the adoption. Financial resources. So I hear a lot of people say, well, I don't know any financial resources. I don't know how I'm going to afford this adoption. So the financial resources is there's a lot of grants and, different scholarships that you can apply for. There's an adoption tax credit that you can apply for the year that you adopt. So the grants and, even different crowdfunding, I know a lot of people have done like different meals at their church where people donate and give $50 to eat a spaghetti dinner. There's garage sales, there's cruises, shirts, bake sales, a ton of different ways to fundraise and ways to build up your savings and build up that financial cost. I know a lot of people even have gotten grants and funds from the adoption agency themselves. A lot of people can donate and say, we want this to go towards the child's adoption. And that child could already come with a $5,000 scholarship. There's adoption airfare that the adoption airfare company works with you to get cheap or severely reduced cost of airplane tickets. There's adoption specific loans at a way lower rate and a way lower interest rate for you to be able to access. Some states offer incentives. Again, like if you're adopting out of foster care, we've already kind of talked about that. You can access like the free lawyer fees, you can access Medicaid and keeping them on their insurance, you can get stipends, things like that. You can also check with your employer and check and make sure that you can have time off for the adoption and that you are able to take FMLA. If you have a company and you work for a company that has 50 or more people, you are eligible for FMLA. So you are able to take that family medical leave is what it stands for. You are able to take that at least up to 12 weeks. And you can take that, it can be unpaid, but that's again maybe part of your funding or your crowdsourcing fundraising efforts is that you fundraise maybe not even to pay for the adoption, but maybe to have some funding available that you don't have to work right away. There's also some Fortune 500 companies that give some money towards the adoption for their employers. And contact your HR. It never hurts to contact your HR department and see if there is any adoption incentives or if you're able to take FMLA for that time. It's always good to know those things and good to kind of think of those things too when you are considering adoption and what type of adoption. So each country has different regulations and different requirements. So that's always something to consider when you are looking at FMLA and you are taking time off. Is that something that your job is you're able to do and able to do comfortably? So there's a ton of financial resources. Don't let that intimidate you. Don't let the cost of adoption intimidate you. Adoption resources on top of the financial resources is obviously you're looking at it, the resource here, and the Friendly Visitor. I run a blog, but I also do these webinars for you guys. And adoption conferences, events, there's CAFO, Strengthening Families, I think is another one. There's a ton of them if you look and you research. There's a lot of really good ones out there, and there's a ton of books. If you go on my blog, I have a list of all the books and books for parenting, but also books for the child. There's Facebook groups. Facebook is a great resource, and there is a lot of Facebook groups out there for fostering adoption, international adoption. A lot of times your agency will even have an international adoption Facebook group for your specific country and your specific program. And sometimes they're most likely private. They will add you to those groups so that you can ask questions, you can see and meet people that are maybe going through that process as well with you guys in the same time, but also just to ask questions and know people that have gone through the program. There is post-adoption programs available and accessible to you if you live in the U.S. Each state has a little bit different and does it differently, but there is a post-adopt resource out there. And I would look up, no matter where you live, look up post-adoption and then your state. Google that, see if any state websites come up. Typically, it'll say right in the state website, so it'll be, .gov or whatever, but look that up and look at what your state does for post-adopt. Every state gets a post-adopt grant by the federal government each year, and so each state runs it differently, owns it differently, but there is some sort of post-adopt incentive and resource for you to tap into. Look up therapists, look up adoption competent therapists. Make sure there is a good adoption competent therapist in your area. Support groups, look at your church, look at different areas, different companies around that may have a foster care or an adoption support group. If you're fostering, if you're looking at foster to adopt, look at those support groups and look at what support groups are run in your area for you to be able to access. international adoption clinics. Typically, a lot of children hospitals have the international adoption clinics. I know a lot of hospitals here in the Midwest have a lot of these international adoption clinics that you can access and you can take your child to once you bring them home. Look at occupational therapy, physical therapy, look at kind of some of those things and talk about it. See, again, if your insurance covers it, if that's something you're willing to do, something you're willing to take your child to. Typically, a lot of children need a lot of services. They need a lot of appointments and a lot of care. So that's something to consider and to think about. You're kind of going through this and you're like, okay, this sounds great. This is wonderful. But how do I prepare for the adoption? How do I prepare to bring this child home? So let's do kind of a self-assessment. Again, we're kind of nearing the end here, so we'll kind of talk about that adoption definition that you wrote down. But it's self-assessment time. And so ask yourself, do I clearly understand my motive for adoption? What is my motive? Is it that this is the way I see us growing our family? We don't have any biological children of our own, and I see us doing this. Is it for religious reasons? Is it because I feel like God has called us to adopt and to take care of the widows and orphans, and I feel like this is a small part that we can do to take care of widows and orphans? Do we as a couple work as a team? Are we both committed to the adoption? Are we both committed to the adoption process? And are we both committed to the adoption in general? A lot of times one person may be on board and the other not. Have I talked with my own children and considered their feelings? If you have biological children, have I talked with them and what do they think about it? What do they say about it? Are they okay with the adoption? Does my lifestyle allow me the time necessary to meet the needs of an adoptive child? Do I have 5 other children and I'm bringing in another child? Do I have a lot going on that maybe I need to scale back in my life? Do I have a lot of things in my schedule that isn't really conducive for me parenting right now? So those are just some things to think about and some things to kind of consider that I think are important. So talk to a family also, how to prepare. I think to get kind of a more clear and honest picture of what adoption is talk to a family that's adopted. Talk to a family that has been there, done that, and talk to a family that's done the adoption that you want to do. So if you talk to a family, if you want to do a private adoption, talk to a family that's done a private adoption. If you want to do international, talk to a family that's done an international. Also, take my post-adopt course before the child comes home. A little shameless plug. But join Facebook support groups. Join the Facebook support groups in your area, specific at least to your state, if not to your county or not to your town. There is a lot of adoption support groups out there. And again, I would recommend start therapy. Start seeing a therapist and being able to really evaluate yourself and you as a family and you maybe as a couple, but also if you are able to bring a child home. This is something that I think a lot of people don't take as seriously as they should. And I think it's something that I think if you have therapy already going, the transition home and the transition of that child coming into your life goes a lot smoother with a therapist and with a mental health professional already on board. Social workers are there to support you, and social workers are going to be there along the way, whether that's with kind of telling you the process and telling you the paperwork or doing the home study or being a part of that agency that you go through. But it is really nice to have kind of that separate third party mental health professional there for you and knowing your history, knowing you guys as a family before this child comes home. And then read books, read the adoption parenting books, watch movies. There's a ton of adoption movies out there. I think some of those things are just interesting to watch and interesting to think about. If you're ever looking for more resources, I have some more adoption resources on my blog. I will cover a lot of that more in the post-adopt side of things too. So this is really just kind of giving you an overall picture. And again, we're kind of considering adoption. So this is sometimes I want you to know that there's resources out there. And if you do decide to adopt, that these resources are available and they're available to anyone and everybody. So I get frustrated, I feel like, when I hear people say, oh, I can't afford it, or I can't afford to adopt, or there's no resources, there's no incentives to adopt, there, is no money in adoption. Well, first of all, there shouldn't be any money in adoption. But that is it for me today. Again, like that's just kind of a very brief overall picture of kind of the adoption process and adoption 101 and just some things to kind of think about and be prepared for. A lot of times I find that couples tell me they get into the adoption process and they haven't really thought of some of these things. And so then they're in the process already knee deep in it and they're like, oh no, I don't know what, like, we haven't talked about this. I don't know. A lot of people should consider some of these things before the process gets started so that you don't feel pressured. You already have an answer beforehand and you know that it's coming and you're more prepared. And so I want you to not be taken aback or blindsided by any of the conversations that happen, but I also want you to feel empowered to make these decisions while somebody isn't staring at you, or the birth mom's not staring at you, or the social worker's not staring at you, and you're like, I don't know. I don't know what we're going to do. Like, and you feel like you have to give them an answer right away. And I mean, you always can say, oh, can we please talk about this? Like, we need to have a conversation privately. Like, can my husband and I call you tomorrow? Or can we, like, can I sleep on it tonight and then get back with you? Like, there's not a lot of times where people feel like they can do that, even though you can, they don't feel like they can. So a lot of times I would just empower you to say, you can have time to think about it, but also these things are good to think about and to know before you get into the process so that some of this isn't skewed and not an immediate response where you feel pressured. So if you're considering, I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you talking with me, and I want you to also look over your definition of adoption and see if that changes after this. And please let me know in the comments or send me an email. I would be more than willing to talk with you. I want to hear from you. I want to hear any feedback you have for me, and I will see you in a couple different webinars. Thanks. Bye.